Park this little lot right here.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cross the way, 30 minutes. Top 28 is my shirt.
Oh, great. Work with Howard.
Definitely with some power. I mean, it's pretty well.
The watershed. As far as the one region forward. As far as the, are you familiar with?
I'm in the community's local government sector, so there's other folks that handle that, but I am not familiar with it, to be quite honest with you. I'm more the community's local government. We have a grant here with town.
How are you, John? Nice to meet you. Yeah. They popped in now. I haven't seen it, but yeah, I heard so. It's very nice.
So we're always this formal when we have a small meeting in town. That's just how we. Tom. All right. Well, thank you for coming, and I'm gonna just say that our planning department's done a ton of work on this. So everybody probably knows Dan Howard and Kim Applebit, but I'll let Dan kind of take it from here.
Morning, everybody.
In the room. Just so who's the millennial here in the room? Oh, the one with the camera, right? Okay, just kidding. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming out this morning. This is a second of three events we have scheduled this week as we wrap this project up. We met yesterday with several design professionals in the region and a lot of town staff to kind of go through what we had learned. And yesterday's presentation was more about technical issues related to the new code that's been developed and the plan amendment that was developed just prior to that. Today, our purpose is to let you all know what we've done, what we've come up with in terms of plan amendment and zoning code amendments that the town will consider in the future. And then we're going to talk a little bit about this project and some lessons learned, let you know what kinds of things resulted from this project that might be transferable to your experiences. You know, Tonawanda is about to start a zoning project, much like this, I think. And then show you some of the products that were developed during this process, and certainly make you aware of them, and then encourage you to look at those and take what you need to take from those to assist you in your work in your communities. So to my left is Lee Einsweiler. I guess we all met each other a moment or so ago. Lee is with Code Studio, been on this project since the very beginning, which is about four and a half years now. Lee was also involved in the development of the town's revisions to its code back in 2006, 2007, which resulted from the town's last major amendment to the comprehensive plan. So he's been around a while. I know he's got some familiarity with the city of Buffalo and some work on the green code as well. So we're happy to have him with us. And I think everyone knows Kim, who's a able, capable, and the star of the show in terms of the long-range planning that we're trying to do here in the town. So a good group of folks. I think Brian's first, so we'll go into his presentation and then we'll work through the project from there.
Sure. So I like to just set the stage for planning in the town of Amherst. We have a robust planning agenda, I guess you could say. I always look for Kim and Dan to agree or disagree with that. So when you think about the town of Amherst, right, the thoughts in Erie County, it's the biggest town in Erie County. You know, it's sort of the second largest municipality after Buffalo and Western New York. But when you frame it a little bit differently, and you start to think about population centers, of course you have Buffalo, in Rochester and Syracuse, but then actually Amherst, right? So it's not only the largest town in Erie County, it's the largest town upstate. In fact, it's bigger than the city of Albany. In terms of gross assessed property value, right, it's actually bigger than Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, or Albany. So there's a lot going on here. 126,000 people, 23 public schools, $127 million annual budget. The town's population, as big as it is, actually increases during the daytime. So as many people as we send into the city to work, that many more people are coming into Amherst. And it's kind of grown up. You know, people will say, well, Amherst is a bedroom community initially. It never really was. In the 50s, when it started to take off, it took off because of plans by the region to invest in infrastructure and a campus up in Amherst, up in the North Campus. So it sort of developed its own kind of local economy. As that was happening, you know, the town's gone through a various amount of changes associated with the fact that UB South Campus sits to our southwest. You know, North Campus is squarely in the center of the town. Damon College, SUNY Erie, all have campuses, all major college campuses right here in town of Amherst. And so we've adapted over the years to become sort of a place where a lot of students, a lot of faculty came to live, right? Most of it was faculty associated with North Campus, and undergraduate housing, a lot of which took place at North Campus and South Campus. Now what we're seeing is the shift by the colleges to put undergrads at North Campus and graduate students at South Campus, and that's driving a lot of different changes in housing and a lot of different changes in terms of what's expected in environment. So as the town, we didn't really take a swing at millennials, right? We sort of stood the plate and watched that pitch go by with the millennial generation. We didn't do a lot to provide the types of spaces millennials wanted to come and invest in. So right now, our focus as a town, both in our sort of program departments and in the planning department, is on Generation Z. That kind of group that's somewhere between elementary school and college now. It's the group that the higher education community is currently spending its time and energy and resource on. And it makes sense for us to sort of mimic that, because we really at the gut of Amherst is a college town presence. So we're looking at Gen Z, and it's a very different generation, right? Very technologically savvy, similar to millennials in some of their preferences, but dissimilar in others. So, you know, we are taking lessons from books like Retrofitting Suburbia and Sprawl Repair Manual, because we see that there is an interest in different types of environments and walkable mixed-use environments. But, you know, it's not sort of that all-in, I have to live in a downtown area necessarily. It's more of a, give me something sort of in the middle. Give me something that's a little bit different. So the product is, you know, it's really a retrofit product that we were after with the zoning, or at least my board's after with the zoning. Talk about that for a minute. Dan and Kim are going to talk about the comprehensive plan. So we have an existing comprehensive plan that's been modified over time. And we're currently in the process of kind of replacing that comprehensive plan. In order to do that, though, we have all these like moving parts. So we have area plans, we have policy plans, we have all this stuff happening in conjunction. And it's not the scenario where you would normally say, do your comp plan, then do your zoning, then do your LWRP. It's been more like, get all those pieces moving, and then, in the words of Bob Shibley, try to assemble the airplane in flight. Because we can't stop working in certain aspects of the town, and it's such a big town that everything's sort of sectionalized. So what we've done as a town board, working with the planning department and other departments, is we've looked at our own economic study done by David Versell, 2016, and that economic study basically said, look, there's essentially 6 economic areas in the town of Amherst that are semi-autonomous. They're connected, but at the end of the day, they're different, fundamentally different areas. And what we've done is we've looked at each one of those areas and tried to dissect it with each one of our departments, saying, what do we need to do in this area of town? What has to happen here? And that's for any department to be successful. Recreation to be successful, highway to be successful, planning to feel like they have some success and control over it. The Chamber of Commerce, the IDA, we've taken in all sorts of comments into each one of these areas, and what we've tried to do is identify nodes of impact, places inside those communities where we can, as a town, allocate capital resource and policy resource to make sure we get sort of the biggest bang for our buck, and equip the town for, for what's coming over the next 20, 30 years. So this is Kim's drawing of the current planning schedule. They have a lot of projects happening, as you can see. And that first project, the one we're here to talk about today, Imagine Amherst, which is the zoning project, has a lot to do with each one of the next series of things, right? So the idea is try to really make big strides here and finish this thing out this quarter, so that later on, all those other projects can build off of it, because it's tied into everything else we're doing. So I call this the old Imagine Amherst project. That's how it started. Imagine Amherst started as a town that needed to change out its general business, and it's sort of manifested now into something a little bit different. But initially it was, hey, we've got a lot of that product out there. Maybe not a lot of malls, but we've got a lot of this product out there in the world, and we need to change this product. What does this look like? What does that zoning regulation start to look like? And, the goal is basically to take that and turn it into this, right? This is the governor's State of the State 2017, an investment interest in the sort of, center of town, or center of the west side of town between the South Campus and North Campus, with proposed light rail coming up, Niagara Falls Boulevard, with redevelopment in Tonawanda and town of Amherst. So, with this sort of in mind, and this has kind of informed some of what it is the town board has attempted to do. But there's other places. There's places like the University Plaza, where we have sort of this underperforming strip plaza, big box type location where we want to see some revitalization. This plan, the zoning is going to touch a lot of different portions of the town. It's not just the mall. It's not just those places. It's areas up in the sort of north of the 290, along our shared corridor with town Tonawanda, talking about, how we transform Niagara Falls Boulevard. If the DOT is coming to the table now and talking about interim steps and longer term visions for the boulevard, well, what does that mean? Because both towns have a critical density of people who use services on the boulevard. It's just that we're set up as auto utopia up there and not as, sort of a traditional main street. So trying to figure out how we both respond to a changing boulevard and how we inform a changing boulevard is important. The next piece sort of south of that's got a major tie-in is an opportunity zone. We were lucky enough to get a federal opportunity zone designation. That designation is Niagara Falls Boulevard, Sheridan Drive, and the 290. It's a large footprint, large area. Our goal is to stimulate new mixed-use, higher densities, taking advantage of the overwhelming amount of student interest in student housing and the overwhelming need for senior housing we have in the area. And we're targeting places inside of that, like the Old Ridge Lee campus, which is a fairly burned out set of buildings at this point. I think it was built as a temporary campus back in the 50s and 60s. So it still remains today. And that's owned outright by the Benderson Corporation. They're looking at revitalizing that using an opportunity fund to invest. The mall itself, which is available online in an auction on April 1st through 3rd. I love the fact that you can auction these things online, right? So April 1st through 3rd, an online auction for the Boulevard Mall. That site obviously needs to be revitalized. We have other retail that's performing very well in the area, with a couple little gaps here and there. So we are kind of looking at all of that space and all of those areas that need to be redone. In the next iterations of zoning, I'm hoping that we can look at some of the office environments that would also be nestled around the sort of transit areas and transit paths. Ultimately, we have other areas we've been talking with UB about and trying to get a project jump started, right? I think in conjunction with Tonawanda and Buffalo, we'd like to still pursue something in that sort of that shared corner of the earth that we all have around South Campus, and all of those sort of open kind of commodities that we have there in terms of general business in Amherst or business structure in Buffalo. For us in Amherst, that means places like this that are sitting vacant right now, and how do we revitalize those types of things, and how do they make sense? Places like this, how do we provide a better public realm amenity? I think we're going to start working on what the town can do in terms of providing better bus shelters and strategic places. This is a big transfer station. You wouldn't know it because nobody's done anything with it, but this is the Main Street to Kenmore bus transfer. And ultimately for the town, I think what we're looking to bring into play here is sort of, kind of that co-op office, casual office, live-work environment, kind of based on sort of an integration of college students in the area, especially with grad students coming into the area. We know there's more of a propensity to live off campus, and so creating the right environments to be able to build on sort of that college town feel. So all those projects, a lot of those projects and more kind of lined up there in planning's realm of reality. They all are feeding off of this because the first thing we need to get right is the land use before we can figure out how to roll anything else. Fortunately, this project was already kind of moving as we started it. So I mentioned the comp plan, and one of the things I suppose we'll talk about during lessons learned is in 2017, an outgoing town board made amendments to the comp plan in December of 2017. And every new town board loves it when the outgoing, town board, outgoing majority town board makes an amendment to the comp plan right before the new town board gets to work in the environment. So, there's a little bit of change coming to that change, and I'll let Kim or Dan talk about that. Yeah.
Okay, got to be able to see it. Okay, so we thought maybe we'd just give you a little bit of insight into why this project, the Imagine Amherst project, and then I'm going to go through a series of slides that just summarize some of the basic information about the activity itself, and then some of the lessons learned, and then we'll jump into the comp plan piece of this thing and the zoning piece. But just for reference, this is the map on the left is the comprehensive plan generalized land use map from 2007. The town put this together with the help of a consulting firm. It reflected the land uses and really, in a lot of cases, the land uses that were in place already, particularly with the areas that are coded in red, which were the traditional shopping areas, which you probably recognize. So does this thing have a pointer on it? Is that it? Okay, so Niagara Falls Boulevard, Transit Road, Sheridan Drive, Maple Road, major commercial corridors that have existed for a long time. So that plan said, okay, these are probably going to stay as commercial, and then we introduced, and it's probably going to be hard to pick out, some areas in here that were more in pink, right? Some down in here, some along these traditional areas along Main Street, which we decided probably ought to be best developed as mixed-use areas. And again, this is 2004, 2006. What we found as the plan went into play, and we got some redevelopment projects and new development projects, and most notably we have 2 hotels in town which were developed along the Main Street corridor, one here at the interchange with the 290 and one just outside the village. I guess this thing is working, but maybe not. 2 fairly large buildings, tall buildings, both in areas that were identified for mixed-use development. And so what became pretty obvious to us is that what we had determined to be mixed use and hope would be this kind of diverse mix of use, both horizontally and vertically, maybe live-work kind of situations, were not necessarily evolving that way. And in fact, more importantly, I don't think the people in the community who looked at the map and saw mixed use really knew what that meant. And so when it manifested itself in terms of a hotel, a 6-story hotel, we had a little problem. Bottom line is the mixed use concept in our plan wasn't well developed, wasn't perhaps articulated as clearly as it should be, but more importantly, the zoning that was on the ground did not correspond with what the plan was calling for. So we changed the plan. We didn't necessarily change the zoning. So a lot of these places that are red and pink, those along Niagara Falls Boulevard, are zoned general business or shopping center, much the same as the properties along Main Street in Williamsville and Eggertsville and Snyder, which are zoned general business. Same set of provisions apply to both places. So what kind of result do you expect you're going to get? Well, we're going to get the stuff that everybody wanted out on the suburban corridors, and nothing that would really match the context and the neighborhoods, especially in the smaller areas, the hamlets, traditional areas. We called those out in the plan. We talked about their characteristics. We indicated that they should be smaller in scale, that they should have mixed uses. It hasn't really worked out that way. And more importantly, we had this, what we come to call now, one-size-fits-all zoning. Either general business or shopping center, which we had on the map throughout the town, and it yields development that we didn't necessarily want. So this kind of mismatch was identified early on, and then subsequently the town does periodic reviews, actually biennial reviews on the comprehensive plan. Two of those in 2012 and 14 really focused on the need to do something about the zoning in these areas, and as a result of that, the town embarked on this Imagine Amherst project. And the intent of this, and it was relatively narrow in scope, was to take a good hard look at our commercial and our mixed-use zoning and what the comprehensive plan calls for, and try to get those things back into sync with what the town residents and certainly the town board and planners felt was a better representation of the desired development in the future. So we can jump back to my slides. For those of you that know me, I'm one-eyed these days, so I don't have all the cool stuff that Brian has. I'm just going to give you the facts. So this project, again, based on town board review and formulation of a project, began with those two reviews in 2012 and 14. We were able to secure a grant through NYSERDA and the Cleaner Greener Communities program. That contract was executed in fall of 2015. Subsequent to that, we entered into a contract with Code Studio to do the technical work. As this thing has gone on, and it has taken more time than I think we all anticipated. Certainly, we've had to extend those contracts. NYSERDA has been generous enough to extend that contract twice for us. Code Studio 3 times over the course of the project. So the town board also, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more in another slide subsequent to this, but town board, one of the first things it did is approved an overall organizational framework for this project. In February of 16, the first working committee meeting took place in March of 16, and then you can see that the comprehensive plan amendment was approved, as Brian mentioned, in late 2017. New town board popped in January of 2018, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and Brian probably has some thoughts on that. It certainly has affected the project to some extent, benefited it, I'm sure, and those extensions on top are due in part to that change. I don't think that's unusual. I'm sure, and I'm looking at folks out here that practice every day. We understand the realities of political change and how that might affect our projects. So should not have been unanticipated, wasn't unanticipated, but certainly had an effect. The plan amendment, basically when the new board took office, they said, you know what, whoa, let's take a minute and figure out what we got here and see whether or not, it's still in keeping with what we believe and what the community believes. So during the April and May of 2018, last year, we conducted 12 neighborhood meetings across the town. The town is divided into 10 geographic areas. We visited each one of those neighborhoods, and we had 2 other small meetings at elementary schools in the area, and I'll explain a little bit about that. A big piece of those meetings was the what we call a visual preference survey, and Kim will talk a little bit more about that, but that was really intended to kind of validate some of the assumptions that we had made about the form of development. And as you know, I'm looking at Nadine. I only know about the green code from what I read in the newspaper, but I'm sure that building height is a major issue. No, he says no. Well, okay. Well, guess what? Out here, it was a major issue, and so we tried to get people's perspectives on this form of development and certainly the height and density, because that was the number one issue that folks really focused on. And then the town board took another look at this project. We formed a different group of people, not altogether different, just brought in some different folks that maybe had come into office or been placed on committees over the period of this little interval we had. So we had a new committee that kind of looked at the zoning amendment. They began that last fall in earnest, and brings us up to this point. Sorry. So just a summary here. The overall project budget is $278,000. NYSERDA contributed and will contribute 161. Town's share is a little under $54,000 in cash. The contract we had with NYSERDA and certainly our initial estimate at this was about $63,000 in staff time, primarily in-kind services. The consultant fee was $215,000. The local contributions to date, and this is as of the end of 2017. We haven't done the 18 summary just yet, but as of the end of 2017, staff time in-kind services amounted to about $134,000. We haven't spent a whole lot on other materials along the way, but certainly it's a big commitment on the part of the town in terms of staffing to do this. So this slide gives you a little, okay. You pushed it and I pushed it? Is that it? Okay.
The budget.
Yeah. This is the generalized timeline for the project. Again, this kind of summarizes where we've been. And probably most importantly, as many of you know, if you worked on a zoning project, we have project completion with NYSERDA at the end of this month. We certainly know there is going to be considerable amount of work we have to do with the community and the town board to implement what will probably be a second amendment to the comprehensive plan, and certainly the zoning code. But I think we're in good shape, and we're on our way. And hopefully, after you see the products, you'll take away a positive impression. So. I know I'm preaching to the choir almost out here, but just to give you an idea of what we've done here. One of the first things we do when we start a project like this is establish the roles, the organization, and lines of communication for the project. I know you probably can't read the chart on the right, but the town board has its traditional roles to authorize the grant, obviously make the funds available for us, and then review and approve the documents in accordance with New York State town law. The planning board has its roles here. The planning board, as the lead agent in formulating the plan amendment and the zoning code, took on the responsibility of appointing the committee members to the initial groups that were responsible for this. They published a memorandum, sent it to the town board endorsed that memorandum with the composition of the committee and with the persons that filled those positions. And then the planning board has their normal recommending authority for the comprehensive plan and the code. You can see on the right, it's not terribly complicated. But that project working committee in the center is really meant to be the kind of the nexus of all this. Take in the input from the consultant, from professional staff, and the town of Amherst residents and other stakeholders, and then push that forward. We exercise that very literally. So the products that we're
put together by Code Studio and staff were provided to this committee for their endorsement and recommendation. The products that we submitted to NYSERDA for consideration and approval were all endorsed by that committee before they went forward to NYSERDA. So that group plays a pivotal role for us. And the other thing I would mention about this is this project included a public participation plan. In our planning work in Amherst, we consider that group to be, and we construct that group to be as representative of the community as we can, because oftentimes we get mixed results with participation. Sometimes there's a lot of folks involved, sometimes not so many. And it's inconsistent in its composition, as I'm sure you all know. This group of people, again, was chosen from across the board, and I'll talk about the composition in a minute, but chosen across the board to be as representative as possible as a town, and to kind of, in the absence of direct and overwhelming public participation, take on the perspectives of their organizations, not asking them to represent the planning board or the ZBA or their homeowners association, but take on that perspective. Bring those perspectives to this process and inform it that way. So again, we had two committees. The first was a project working committee. This group was in play primarily during the comprehensive planning process. We had a town board liaison. We had a couple of planning board members, a couple of members of the ZBA. The Conservation Advisory Council had representation here. The village had a representative. And we had members from recognized, and I say this guardedly, recognized homeowners associations. So the town has, I don't know, about a half a dozen or so homeowners associations in place that are consistent and not necessarily just issue oriented. And you probably know what I'm talking about. So we really wanted to find folks from established organizations that we thought could be sustained over the course of the project, and had experience as organizations, so they could bring that information back to their organization and or bring those perspectives to this process. And then we had representatives from small business and the development community. Second committee, which came into play late last year, the zoning update committee. The supervisor has been the chair of that committee. There is a town board liaison there. There's planning department staff, building department staff, members of the planning board, ZBA, the IDA, and then we've had great support from Erie County Department of Environment and Planning and GBNRTC, who have had representatives at each one of these meetings. One thing that became clear to us, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a few moments, there's planning and there's zoning, and I think we probably all recognize the difference. And the zoning is extremely technical, and so this is a more technical task. So we did change the composition a little bit, and this group has worked together really well and been very helpful. Throughout the planning process and somewhat during the zoning code piece, we did have representation from UBRI as well. So we've been fortunate to have a lot of folks participate in our process, not just from within Amherst, but the region as well. So I thought one thing I wanted to do is just go through some lessons learned through the process, and I'm actually going to ask Lee and Brian and Kim if they want to chime in on some of these. I'll just go through these as quickly as I can, but if you've got any insights to share in this, feel free to jump in. I just kind of talked a little bit about the project organization, defining those roles of responsibility and the lines of communication. Certainly, it's in our experience to get town board approval and participation in this process. Sometimes it's convenient to step back and say, all right, we're going to make this as apolitical as possible. We're not going to have anybody from the town board, and it's probably not a good idea. because in the end, those are the folks that are going to be asked to act on this, and they certainly are extremely helpful in informing the other members of the board. So I would not recommend anything but that. Get some folks on the town board involved in this. And Brian noted, and we've talked a little bit about this, we did have, you have changing membership on these boards, so you have to be prepared to adapt to that. And I think we've successfully done that, had good folks from both of those boards sustaining their valuable participation in this. As far as the intent and purpose, just again, make sure you get clear intent as you move forward with this thing, this kind of project. I'm going to stop for a moment. I am going to ask for some insight from my colleagues here. Planning versus zoning and the role of each in a project. It's very challenging, I think, for people in the community to understand the technical difference between the two. And I had one instance that I recall very clearly. I had a meeting very late in the process as we were working through the comp plan amendment, and I had a resident who had been fairly active and commented frequently on the project. And I sat down at a small group table, and this person was talking about zoning, and I just kind of kept looking at her and say, planning, not zoning. And and we laugh and we smile because we're all in the profession, but it's very clear to us what the distinctions are, right? It's not to the community, and most people don't mean this disparaging, don't get that difference. And this played a pretty critical role in the process of even the plan amendment, where we essentially had to kind of stop in the middle of the plan amendment process to develop a good sense of what the framework would be for the zoning, because people in the town are sophisticated, and I don't mean to imply that they don't know what's going on. They do. They don't just understand that nuanced difference. But they knew enough to say, if you're telling me that the plan says this, then you must mean that the zoning is going to say something like that. And I want to know what the zoning is. I don't really care what the plan says. The zoning is what's going to determine what's going to happen here. So I'm not sure how you do this. I'm looking at Jim because I know he's got a project coming up relatively soon in terms of zoning, and I would say, just think that through a little bit and expect that there's varying levels of understanding and expectations. I don't know if anybody, Brian.
I guess it's funny coming from the planning world and then being all of a sudden at the helm or as in the executive seat, right? So Dan and I probably have spent an infinite amount of time in his office or my office, kind of racking our heads on things where Dan is saying, we got to get the plan right, and I'm looking at him like, give me the tools so I can go out and create the economic development, right? So, in vice versa, we're throwing stuff at Dan constantly that they're having to adjust to. Dan has some of those up on the board, but all of a sudden saying, hey, guess what? We got an opportunity zone. What does that mean? How does that impact what you're thinking about doing? And by the way, your time frame for planning along the boulevard just shrank to June of this year. And we have to complete a GIS and a whole bunch of other stuff in order to make some of those developments happen. So the zoning piece becomes kind of an interesting subject matter there, because it's kind of a catalyst and a tool and a rules of the game for engineers and for the executive's office, and at the same time it's still got to be an outcome. So I can't emphasize the amount of tension that we've been under for about a year and a couple months because of this project, just as it tried to complete itself in a technical manner, and then all of a sudden sort of all hell breaking loose kind of in terms of things happening in other portions of the town. So I guess that's a compliment back, but it just goes to show that that the two, even though they're separate, just sometimes they just get mashed together, and you have to be able to move both at once. And
So, and part of that, I think, is, and part of Lee's design in the scope of work is to fairly early on, after you've worked at this a little bit, spend a considerable amount of time on a charrette, which we'll talk about. Kim will go into a little bit. There's this point at which the contract calls for us to, take a knee and get confirmation of direction that we've found ourselves going with the town board. Kind of that interim step, right? Like, okay, are we heading in the right direction? Well, this happened fairly early in the process, right after the charrette, which would have been about 6-7 months after the project began, and we did that. Although I'm not sure the town board at the time really had taken the time. Maybe we didn't do a good enough job of telling them where we were going. I think they got it, but I don't recall the participation and the interest elevated as part of that. And in fact, they gave us a confirmation of the direction, but again, I'm not sure they were fully aware of what where things were going. I don't mean that to be critical, just a reality check, I guess. Bottom line to that is, it's probably a good idea to do this more than once. And I don't know if you want to comment on that from your experiences.
Well, I think the reason we use that idea is because drafting is an expensive process, and you don't want to create a draft that's so off base that everybody tells you to replace it, basically. There's not enough money in the contract to do that. You're never set up to do that. It's like one and done, right? So the notion is to try to figure out as much as you can about what you're going to write before you write it. So we did that, but we ended up, in essence, talking to the wrong people because we were about to have a change in the board. So the trigger was pulled, the comp plan amendment was adopted. We thought we had confirmation. We thought we were headed off. The horses are out of the gate. And frankly, we discovered that the desires of the community, as expressed by their votes in the next election, had been unsatisfied by the direction that we had gotten previously. And so, if I could have, I would have immediately done a new confirmation of direction. We didn't really have that choice, and the supervisor cooked up a way to rethink that. You'll hear a little bit about it, but basically a reconfirmation of where the community was at. That changed the steering a little, but as much as anything, sort of poured oil on the waters that had gotten roiled by the fact that decisions were made in the 11th hour by the old board, and they weren't the same people who got voted in for the new board. So this idea is an important one, and I guess I would just say, if you have shifting leadership, whether it's the planning director, whether it's the planning board, whether it's the town board, it's probably a really good idea to get to those folks early on. Make sure they really understand your project and all the steps you've taken, and make sure that you're still headed in the right direction.
I guess the other factors that came to play here were some of the changing development conditions, and Brian's mentioned the opportunity zone. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. We got representation from the NFTA here, and of course they're in the throes of an environmental consideration of an extension to the light rail system. But prior to that, we had alternatives analysis and some things that were coming along again, which were kind of external factors. Try to incorporate those ideas and those factors into the process as you're working through it. Just things to think about. Nothing is static. Nothing stays the same. Public engagement plan. We're all good planners, so we're all up for the importance of public engagement. We had what we thought would be a pretty
pretty good set of techniques we were going to try and employ. One of the first products we asked of the consultant was a participation plan that was created in conjunction with staff. So we had a plan. You will have a plan. First casualty of battle is the plan. You have to be flexible and open to new approaches. We certainly were, but just to give you some idea of what some of the things were that we worked through, we had a 5-day charrette. That's a very expensive proposition, as you may or may not know. It yielded some what I consider to be some pretty good products across the board. I guess we can kind of talk about their overall effectiveness in this process. We had several meetings. I mentioned the committee. They met almost on a monthly basis. And actually, I don't know if I skipped over this back in the back. I did. I just wanted to point this out real quick. Yeah. That committee met almost 35 times over the course of this project. In addition to that, there were 12 meetings that I mentioned involving the VPS and 5 different hearings or meetings. So this process involved a lot of meeting, a lot of time on the part of a lot of folks.
Talk a little bit about the website.
Yeah. You're getting it back? Okay. And I didn't have a lot to do with the administration of the website. Actually, Kim did. I don't know if Kim, if you want to comment on that in terms of the overall content and control of the website and the maintenance of that, because the website is a big part of any project anymore.
Yeah, so we originally had started with a standalone website that a separate consultant had worked on, and so they had kind of overall oversight over that. It was a little difficult at times because you kind of have to go through them, and they may not be as close to the process as we are. So trying to relay the information to them to get it on the website, get it in the right spot, describe it to who would be interested. So that's a little bit of a challenge, but we thought the website worked pretty well. We would have schedule of events up there. Any of the work products that the committee had endorsed, we would put up. So that was pretty great. Once the kind of change in the boards happened, and we kind of went with a different direction for that, we sort of said, well, we should kind of take a look at this. How can people better access this, know where it is? Most people are familiar with the town's website, and so we tried to, migrate all the material that was on that standalone website to the towns. And because we did these neighborhood meetings that Dan described, and I'll describe a little bit more, we also said, well, that material should be included there as well, sort of related to this project, helping to confirm some of the direction of that. So we kind of migrated all of that over to the town's website. I think at the end we may show you that, just if you're interested. All the information has been very transparent. We've had it up there since the beginning. People were able to access it whenever they like. So Dan had a few stats up there.
I don't know if I don't know if you mentioned this or not, but this is something you're going to want to consider. So Amherst has an open government committee, and they're very active, and we've got some requirements here which basically mean that every meeting of this committee was recorded, video recording, and those video recordings are put up on the website. That we don't have the internal technical capability to do that. We depend on other departments to do it. So there's some work and liaison with other departments to make that happen. But that is an expectation in this community. And so I'm not sure what you'll face in your communities as you do this kind of work. It does provide a very convenient archive of the project. And it does provide certainly an opportunity for folks to go back and learn about the project, participate in the project such as it is by not coming to meetings and just understanding what's going on, and then able to comment on things if they wish. So that's a big part of the website, and it's turned out to be a little bit more logistical challenge for us sometimes. One of the other problems we had, and again, this is really fundamental, but you're sitting in the town's meeting room. This literally is the room that the town, the only room in the town that we're actually able to record meetings. So the requisite criteria for finding a place to have meetings for us was we had to be able to record them. So this room doesn't lend itself to committee work, where you have some tables and chairs you like to spread out and do some work, large documents, maps. So we were fortunate throughout this process to have the Village of Williamsville allow us to use their chambers, which is more of a traditional meeting room, which allowed us to do those kinds of things, spread things out, and they had the capability to record the meeting. So we actually had to go off and find a different site to do this. It's convenient, it's right across the parking lot. But as we faced other challenges with scheduling, we had to find other places in town. We had a couple of meetings, I think, at Sweet Home Middle School that we were not able to record. We took photographs and put them on the website, but we couldn't record those. So again, just kind of match the expectations of your community with your capabilities and facilities as you move forward with this kind of thing. We've talked a lot about technology. We'll talk more about that. The other theme here that I think warrants, well, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the bus tours first. So one of the things we did do early on with our committee and then opened it up to the public was conducted a couple of bus tours of shopping centers in the town, try and get people more acquainted with the centers from a planner's perspective. So we all go to shopping centers, we all go out on Saturday afternoons and then, engage the traffic, and we pull in, do our shopping. We tried to give folks on the committee, and the second tour we took was just general call for anyone that was interested in going. Our perspective of shopping centers. This is what we see. We see, parking lots. We see the access points that interfere with pedestrian activity. We see buildings that are set back too far. The traditional kinds of things that we would look for in these places, and point those out to the committee members and the public and say, this is the kind of stuff we're looking at. We would like you to help you understand what those things are. So as we go through this process, you'll look for those things as well. The other one I wanted to mention here was generational differences, and I made a little comment at the beginning at Jonathan's expense for a moment. But that difference in generation and age is real, and it seriously affects a project like this. There's a large number of people. There's 125,000 people that live in the town. It's demographically split up by ages, as you might imagine, and I think still the majority of folks in this town are a little older. And there's a lot of folks that are basically the baby boomers and older in the town. They tend to be more active, and they live here because they like it here, and they're not necessarily always thinking that change is the best thing for them to have to experience at this point in their lives, and after making investments in their home and their community. On the other hand, we have younger folks who are moving to town who definitely have ideas about how the town ought to evolve and expectations for it. Those two don't match sometimes, and we recognize that early on. You probably have too in some of your work. One of the things I mentioned earlier is we did a visual preference survey at a couple of elementary schools during ice cream socials, because quite frankly we couldn't get those folks being parents of young children or younger folks in general to come to meetings, because they're in the midst of their lives, whatever reason they can't make the meetings, but they were at the ice cream social, and I think we ended up with about 450 overall, but probably close to about 150 at the ice cream socials.
Yeah, between the two.
Who would stop at the ice cream social and do a visual preference survey with us and tell us what they thought about building form and type and density. And so that helped us do two things, right? We better understood the validation of those elements of the plan and the code, and it also gives us an idea of what kinds of things we need to be thinking about in the future. So, again, and Jim, I'm looking at you because I know you're about to get into this, and you've got the same demographic composition in your community. You're gonna face this kind of what I call generational tension over where the town ought to go, and not sure how to tell you how to navigate it. Just got to be, you're a planner, just be open-minded and kind of move through it.
We did do one thing that turned out to be really useful during the period of the charrette, which was through the parents of older children, we reached out to a set of millennials who sort of self-organized, who had moved away from Amherst and were living in Buffalo, and asked, what would it take to get you back from Buffalo into Amherst? And they could describe that for us fairly eloquently. And it starts really simply, more coffee shops, more places to get a beer, etc. In the course of this project, of course, Ginny's Ice Cream shows up here at the mill. What's the name of the beer place right down the street here, too? Yeah, and so, a number of sort of things that would make millennials happy had showed up in Williamsville. But if you stop and ask yourself, how are we going to get those at the mall site or, somewhere else? You're just kind of, it's like, wow, it's going to be nigh on impossible, right? So being able to get that input and start to think about, how am I going to actually entice that person back? Yes, I have a great school district, but some of them were telling us to our faces that they were going to fight for a great school district in Buffalo instead, because the rest of the stuff was more important than just the great school district. I think that was a little shocking to hear back on this side of the line again, because Amherst has for many years lived on its great school district. I do think there are some ways to talk about this stuff, and that it's really critical to get it into the mix. It did affect the final outcomes of what we were generating.
The last point on this is this. We talk a little bit about project tenure and board changes. Again, just be wary of the time it takes to do this, and certainly how the changes in boards and personalities may affect the project. Excuse me. In terms of the plan amendment, we talked a little bit about this a moment ago. Height became a predominant theme in the plan amendment, not in the zoning amendment necessarily, but almost immediately, height was the main issue that most of the people who were participating in this glommed onto. Did not want tall buildings, especially in some of the traditional parts of the town. And we talked through that. We went from 2 stories to 2.5 stories to 3 stories. We had the economic discussion about development and builders' willingness to build buildings that were higher than 2 or 2.5 stories, and how that feasibility would work in terms of redevelopment. And height was just an overwhelming theme throughout with the folks that were participating in this. So in large part, some places we just kind of concede to that and say, okay, it is what it is, and go back to this kind of generational thing and understand that at some point, even there are younger folks who are looking for a little more density, a little more mix of uses that can be achieved in a traditional two-story building, and at some point their time will come, and we can make the adjustments to the zoning as needed, and that theme carried right over into the code development. Kim will talk a little bit about the differences that we've been managed to achieve through this process. Just kind of look on the zoning side here. We'll talk a little bit more about the different forms and types of development that we've found to be the predominant styles that we want to pursue here in the town. and we'll talk a little bit more about the zoning. We essentially went from 13 districts to 6. We started off with 13 different districts. We're down to 6 now. As we talk about the opportunity zone, as we talk about the differences between traditional development and what we're calling now retrofit development, which is treatment for the suburban areas in the town, we start to look at city blocks as kind of that organizing principle for the retrofit. And again, Lee will talk a little bit more about that. And then there's some plan review procedures that we're going to talk about. Lastly, I just wanted to mention some of the transferability from this project to maybe your experiences, your work that you're going to undertake in the future. Again, we did a fairly extensive charrette activity. There's a lot of products on the website that you can use to help understand a little bit about that process. Here are the products that would result from that and their usefulness. Kim talked about the website, critical part of public engagement at this point, and probably requires a fair bit of discussion before you go ahead and implement things. And I'm guessing you may be in the same position we are. We don't control the website. We only suggest what goes up on it, and our IT department kind of controls some of the content. The content's not really the issue. It's the technical ability and access and ability to make changes. Our folks are really, really cooperative here, but it is a factor in your planning. The visual preference survey, Kim will talk a little bit about that. We were able to employ some technology there that I think was kind of interesting and intriguing. Jonathan would really like it. I'm really taking my shots today. And one of the other things that we're kind of morphing into here is this idea of architectural design. And so as a result of the zoning discussions that we've had, we're finding ourselves at the behest of the supervisor and the committees that we're working with, working toward more design-oriented considerations, particularly in the traditional areas of the town. Lee, when he describes the code, it's just not a form-based code, but it is a code that has a lot of form-based elements to it. And so design and standards and architectural review, we think are probably going to become more prevalent as we move forward with this. Lastly, just a couple of slides. This was a NYSERDA project. As part of this project, we were required to come up with some estimates of project benefits. It was very specific metrics that NYSERDA specified. There'll be a test on these at the end, especially the chart on the right-hand side. Just understand that that part of this project, a big part of this project, was to try and address some of NYSERDA's goals, especially in terms of sustainability and sustainable forms of development. And so we made estimates of different aspects of environmental benefits that might accrue from this. The primary ones that apply to this project involve energy use, particularly in gasoline savings. We anticipate that there will be modest savings. This is, zoning and planning is only a component of the built environment and how that will affect transportation in the future, but it is clearly something to consider here. We looked for the opportunity to create jobs through the development that might result from this and the introduction of new forms of land uses and new businesses that might result. So we make an estimate on those. The idea of LEED certified buildings or neighborhood characteristics. So this project probably more addresses the LEED neighborhood characteristics, and we think that the kinds of things that we're proposing here very definitely address many of those characteristics. And then finally, it's hoped that there will be some effect on vehicle miles traveled and general overall use of energy and transportation. And certainly the mixed-use forms of development that are encouraged here is hoped will result in a diminishing number of trips. where you can make a multi-purpose trip, both in terms of your vehicle and walking in and around the places that might result from this, or maybe living and working in the same kind of environment, or the same environment that would reduce the number of trips that you're expected to produce. And then this whole idea of parking once, so you can park the car and walk around. All of that is meant to kind of affect the overall VMT that communities experience. We made initial estimates for this as part of the grant. We'll be updating those based on the code that results from this, and see if we can't provide a little more information there for people to work through in the future. And then finally, there's additional local sustainability indicators. Again, I won't get into these in any great detail, but there is a requirement to look at these and look at how the work that you've done, particularly in terms of the zoning in our case, and how it would affect things like walk scores, housing and transportation, affordability indices, number of new homes and their proximity to new centers that encourage walking, and again, the VMT consideration and commute time. So very specific metrics that we try to tie to this work, and we'll be working over the next couple of weeks to try and update these and provide that information to NYSERDA, and hopefully inform some work that's being done in other places or will be done in other places. So with that, it's a long description, but we wanted to make sure we took the time to talk about the project and some of the challenges and lessons learned for us. Now I think I'm going to turn it over to Kim, who's going to talk about the plan process. Did we want to take a break? Do we need a break? Anybody? No, this is riveting, I guess. So we'll continue on. Go ahead. Yeah.
All right, so as Dan alluded, I'm going to talk a little bit about the comprehensive plan process, which is what we did first. And as he described, its goal was to reimagine and improve the commercial and mixed-use center in the town, so they work better with the surrounding context, because we really hadn't thought about that before. It was very generic, and we labeled them something, but we really never, converted that to actions or to policies or to the zoning. So we really tried to do that with this project. And so, as Dan alluded to, there were two committees started at the beginning of this project. The working committee, which had a lot of members from boards, committees from the town, business owners, homeowners groups, developers, that sort of thing. And then we had that technical committee, which we learned later on that actually works a little bit better with the zoning when you get into those technical details. So first, what we really focused on was trying to, look around the region, look around, anywhere, and to sort of look at these precedent studies. And Code Studio put these together for us to sort of examine what was going on there. And so I just pulled up a few. One of them was from Irondequoit, New York. This one was really focused on a few blocks, more of a small town center. So we kind of looked at this as small scale development, how we could look at that. And Lee put together a lot of information about these. You can see in the bottom corner all the key facts, how much was dedicated to commercial, office, that sort of information from each one of these places. So this was one example that we looked at. A second was from College Town, which is in Rochester, not far away from here. So we thought this was a great example, really could apply locally, as it's already kind of worked somewhere else close. So this was really sort of a public-private partnership, and it actually included an overlay district for this area. It was a little bit larger area than the previous example I showed, and this one actually dealt a lot more with architectural standards, which we sort of started to develop as we went through this process, that's something we're interested in having more control over. So this was a great example of that sort of thing, and creating sort of like a large-scale center, which now we know would probably be a great example for our mall area. And then just a third example is from Massachusetts. This one was actually a suburban retrofit of a mall center. So at the time we weren't really thinking too closely about the mall, but obviously this will be a great example for us to look at as well. And this is quite a large area, but it really kind of creates a town center within it. So you get sort of that character of your traditional areas while still, having that large redevelopment area. So really, we looked at these.
Kim, just for a minute. So just, again, the importance of these is really to educate the folks that are working on the code with you, particularly the committees, because they need to see examples of this stuff. And one nice thing is that Code Studio found these sites, gave us some images, but also broke down some of the data in terms of floor area and whatnot, which gives people a little sense of scale when you're talking about these projects, and they can relate those back to their own community.
So once we kind of had this information, we started thinking about our commercial and mixed-use centers in town. We did this sort of charrette week. Code Studio was here for about a week. I think the real great event that we had during this was on our first day when we had a hands-on workshop. We probably had about 50 people attend. We kind of gave them an overview of our precedents, what we were trying to accomplish, and then broke off into tables and really worked with them on different pilot centers. And I'll just kind of describe to you what was put together for those and what we may have heard. So one example was Eggertsville. We were kind of considering this for maybe a more traditional center, and we really focused on the large parcel, the Key Bank parcel, which is vacant pretty much as of today. So this is a great redevelopment site in one of those traditional areas that could probably support a little bit more density because of its size and location. And so, we looked at sort of the characteristics that existed there today. We looked across the street and said, is this something we want to replicate here? How could we do that on this site? And so Code Studio gave us a lot of great information, sort of laid out the existing conditions of the site, how we may want to break that up, considering the surrounding context. So with this site, directly adjacent is a lot of residential area. So we wanted to kind of take that into consideration as we looked at this. And so they kind of gave us two options for this as we were thinking about it, and the groups kind of came up with some of these ideas, is, we could probably break this up into a more, either with residential at the back and keeping the building at the front, should that be something we want to retrofit and keep. Maybe, spice it up a little bit with a different facade. So that was kind of the one option they said. And then, if we're really trying to re-envision the area, how can we incorporate the density and the height? And so, keeping that residential buffer in the back, some sort of townhome or duplexes or something, abutting the residential to try to transition up to the mixed-use area along Main Street. Creating separate buildings, more architectural appeal, that sort of thing. And so, with the ideas from that group, Code Studio came up with these great renderings, sort of displaying that information, and, showing the different heights, how that would relate to existing buildings that are there today, seeing that transition back to the residential area. So this sort of was our example of that more traditional area in town.
So I'm just going to jump in and make a comment before the supervisor gets to make it, because he's right about it. And that is, we got to quit doing these beautiful aerial views. They're fabulous. We understand them. You can explain them to the general public. But the view we needed that we don't have, that could have been done while our watercolorist was here, is what does it look like when I'm standing on the street? Probably the most important view here.
Yesterday at lunch, I made the comment about banning three bird's eye view perspectives and axometrics. They get, everybody focuses on the height of the structure, which you can't recognize when in your first person perspective. You never really see that third story, especially if it's so.
Just another example of one of the pilots we looked at. A separate table looked at some of our more suburban type centers, and this is actually Gettsville Plaza on Millersport, if you're familiar with that area. So this is like our typical, strip center, shopping mall type of thing. Very, there's a lot of parking surrounding the entire thing. There's no connection to the neighborhood at all. And so, taking those existing conditions, even with this, this scenario, Stall kind of runs into Millersport, and it's an interesting intersection. You know, how can we maybe slow that down and kind of give it back to the residential area that's around it? And so actually we kind of cut that off and said maybe this should be more of a pedestrian connection to the Audubon community that's right next door. So that's actually one of the things we even looked at is, you know, these street configurations and connections to the neighborhood. Again, this has a residential connection in the back. So to sort of, you know, mimic the other side of the street. And then actually with this scenario, maybe some of the buildings would remain or just get split up a little bit to kind of create a little bit more visual interest. And we still have the parking. Obviously, that's something that is probably going to be needed in Amherst for a little bit longer. So, you know, giving that what Lee calls teaser parking in the front with a few rows of parking while still making the rest available to the site, just not viewed from the street. So that was sort of a suburban example that we looked at. And then one other that we thought would be good to look at during this and get people's opinion on is these sort of shallow corridors. So we looked at Transit Road very far south near Worley, and you know how that transition to the neighborhood works from such a shallow parcel. So with this example, there's actually two different kind of scales. There's one that's the commercial is the entire block, and then the residential is across the street. And then there's one where it's a half a block, and the residential is directly adjacent or behind it. So, you know, how can we create these transitions that work? Sometimes, like we saw in the other examples, it's that residential that backs up. And other times, it's really what people typically we hear about at meetings is these, like, you know, berms, very deciduous trees, evergreens, even a wall or a fence. So we kind of realized that there's these different situations with deeper and shallower parcels, and how we can address those with different transitions is an important factor for the community. So with this input that we received from the community, we kind of said, well, we're thinking that there's maybe two forms of development: this traditional that we saw, you know, with the Eggertsville example, and then the suburban, which, you know, is a lot of the different major arterials in the town. So we came up with these two different forms, and then types within those forms: centers, corridors, medium scale nodes, and low scale nodes. And these actually have evolved since we did the charrette, and Lee's going to touch a little bit about how these have changed. But I'll just go through what we came up with at this point. So the traditional form, as most of you probably know, is more of the Main Street feel with buildings pulled up to the sidewalk, you know, very little front setbacks with on-street parking, you know, large sidewalks for pedestrians, parking in the rear, it's not visible to the street, and then a lot of signs, sign regulations on these buildings. You know, as people walk by, they're going to need to know what they're seeing. Sometimes they're located along slower streets. We have a lot along Main Street, which is a little bit of a different feel, but we do have a lot of these areas in Eggertsville, Snyder, that type of area. And then we have suburban form, which is more of our shopping centers. Obviously, these have a lot of parking around them, seas of parking. They have large front setbacks. Sometimes that includes some landscaping or some green area. A lot of times that includes parking. There's usually no on-street parking. Larger arterials with higher speeds. So people aren't really walking in these places. There's not really that sense of place. And then our four types. So center was really like our large areas that could accommodate a lot of height, a lot of density. Maybe be broken up by different streets and blocks. They're larger parcels. And like I said, we actually had, originally we had said 3 to 8 stories. And from the community, as Dan mentioned, height was a huge issue. And they said, well, you can't exclude 1 story. So we kind of said up to 8, 1 to 8, to sort of include those should they arise. And then corridors, our second type. These are really sort of, as you can imagine, linear in form along some major roadways. They may or may not be located next to residential. As you can see in the example there is on one side, it's directly adjacent to the residential, and the other side it has much larger parcels. So the way you deal with these may be a little bit different depending on the case, how they're located in its context. and they have consistent parcel depth, usually on one side versus the other, sort of that consistent parcel depth in a linear form. And these are probably a little bit shorter, depending on their size. Walmart is in this example, so you may be able to accommodate a little bit more height there, but the one on the other side next to the residential may not be able to accommodate that height. And so we originally started off talking with the committee about a node, and as we started talking through this, we kind of said, well, they're thinking about it in different scales. So how can we accommodate these nodes in different scales? So we kind of came up with the two different scales, medium scale and low scale. So medium scale is much like a center, but at a smaller scale. It's at intersections of roads. This is something that's a little bit different from centers and corridors. They're usually that center of activity at an intersection. And they can have moderate parcel depth. The Eggertsville example I showed from the charrette, maybe consider that kind of moderate parcel depth. And then these could accommodate a little bit more height, maybe up to 4 or 5 stories, depending on, that parcel size and what they can fit on that side. And then the low scale node is what we really talked about a lot with the committee. A lot of the areas in Amherst and even a lot of the traditional areas, they considered low scale node. They wanted them to sort of remain the same in their scale and intensity. So again, they're located at intersections, and a lot of them have a little bit of more of the traditional form. They have smaller parcels, and so the buildings may be pulled a little bit closer to the street because of that, small depth. And so we had that discussion of height a lot with this center, or this type, and we started at 3, tried to push for 3, and the 2.5 sort of emerged, a functional half story. And the half story actually gives more of a residential character with pitched roofs. So it fits in a little bit more with the lower scale of these.
It's interesting, too, that over the course of this project, we had one project in town, at least one, and the one I'll point to is a project down the street, down Main Street, that Jonathan Bevilacqua built, which is a full 3-story building, mixed-use building right across the street from Williamsville South High School. You've probably seen it. Its signature feature is it's got a Lloyd taco in it. So, that form of development, it has come to the town, and it looks like it's going to be fairly successful. Despite that, I'm not sure we're going to be able to fit that in everywhere. But we've got a good example locally of what can be done and what it may look like in an area which is really relatively close to residential. So some things have evolved there, and again, we got a good local example.
These are just some illustrative examples that we've put in the comprehensive plan to sort of, demonstrate what these different types may look like. They are not like specifically from Amherst. Code Studio kind of pulled them out of their repertoire of images, but it sort of gets people thinking about the scales of these. You can describe them all you want, but illustrative examples really help to give that idea of the differing scales of these types. So obviously the center has that more height, where the low scale node is very, small business oriented and walkable. You see a lot more people on the streets. So these are just examples. They'll probably be updated as we go through more of this process. Dan sort of already described these, but with this, the committee sort of talked about how the planned future land use map looks, and we took those red areas and pink areas that were the commercial and mixed use and said, well, we should be encouraging mixed use in all of these areas. And so we could kind of categorize them the same. Even some of the centers may have dropped off. There was like a center around the hospital, and we said, maybe this isn't the best place to centralize our commercial and mixed use development. So we thought about, places that shouldn't really be encouraged with those. And then we also took some of them and placed them in what we call like special centers, where they have specific, characteristics that may be slightly different. So with this new map, with all the areas classified as mixed use, commercial mixed use. We took what we came up with, those forms, 2 forms and 4 types, and created a supplemental map, which we're calling Figure 6A, and sort of said, how do we categorize each one of these commercial centers that we've identified in the plan? So we took all the pink areas, created a separate map, and started to categorize them. So we said, first off, are they traditional or suburban? So we sort of labeled those from, reds and to blues. And then we said, based on their conditions, based on their scale, parcel sizes, how they fit with the neighborhood, is that a center, a corridor, a low-scale node, medium-scale node? So we came up with this map. It really designates based on the context around them. It gives us a little bit more idea of how the zoning may work within those centers and how they differ. Whereas Dan mentioned before, the GB was kind of your overarching district that was everywhere, and it was producing sort of the same result, and didn't take into consideration that context. Okay, so that's where we ended in 2017 when the plan was adopted by the Old Town Board. And so the new town board came on, and the supervisor said, well, we should check this with the community before we continue on. So we came up with these 10 neighborhood meetings in April and May of last year. Dan sort of mentioned them before. We derived sort of the geographies of them based on the fire districts. We thought that was a pretty good way to easily distribute the town into these areas.
The only real benefit to having 10 fire districts.
And so we gathered comments from anybody that attended, stakeholders, regarding their desires for that specific neighborhood. We really tried to focus on, if you live in this neighborhood, you come to this specific meeting, so we can get your ideas from that neighborhood. Dan mentioned we did 2 ice cream social events, and that really helped in getting to the people that, that younger generation. It's hard for us to invite them to meetings. They have busy lives. They're not interested in, putting those things on hold to come to a meeting. So it really helps to go to them, to events that they have already scheduled in their calendars. And those ice cream socials were very informative. When I talk about the VPS in a second, I'll tell you how the differing, ideas came out. And then we also talked with some younger students, some like high school, early college students from one of our youth programs. Just to see, what their ideas were as well.
Kim, if I might, just so if you're planning to do this, one of the challenges, we fell into the ice cream social thing, just fell into it. We were doing a meeting at Windermere, and I mentioned to the principal that, it'd be nice, can we meet with their teachers? Can we meet with, some of the PTA or, some of the parents? Because we just weren't getting those kinds of folks at these meetings. And so we fell into the ice cream social. Then we fell into another one, an art show, really, is what it was with ice cream. What I would suggest is, think about this early and get to the schools early and understand what their schedules are, because they're not going to schedule something for you necessarily. You're going to pop up in their location, take advantage of their events. So if you want to do this kind of thing, you need to work closely with the schools as you're putting this thing together and try to understand what opportunities might exist there.
So at these meetings, we conducted 2 activities. One was a concentric circle exercise. It's pretty broad. You ask people, what they like historically from their neighborhood, what they like currently, and what they'd like to see in the future. That was more of gathering of information for future comprehensive planning. But really what related to this project was the visual preference survey. And so what we did was we took various images. I have a few examples up here, some office complexes, more modern-y architecture, even some residential examples and how those can be a little bit different. And then, your classic traditional type development. Taking these various images, thinking about the neighborhood that you're in, and then we showed them to them. And what we did was something really cool with newer technology is, we have a polling system, and people can sign on their phones, and as you show the image, they can poll and rate it between, what we did was a 1 and a 5. 1 is was like, I hate it, please don't put it in my community. 5 was like, I love this, put it in tomorrow. So we sort of said, rate it based on your thoughts. And we really only gave them 20 to 30 seconds to think about it. Initial gut reaction to what they were looking at. And then the results actually showed up live on the screen. So people could kind of see how they're relating to their neighbors, what other people were liking as well. So that was really something that was interesting. And what we found from this was, we did this same sort of exercise without the technology at the ice cream socials, and we sort of compared the results. And the ice cream social results saw a lot more tolerance and like for the taller buildings that we showed, and in that more traditional form. Whereas, places like Swarmville or, East Amherst preferred a lot more of the like one-story office type of development. So we really saw the differences come out when we saw this visual preference survey emerge.
If I might, 2 things. Be prepared, a poll everywhere is what we used. Be prepared for people who not to be able to use their phones, not want to use their phone, not have a phone, have a flip phone, whatever. So we had paper
Voting sheets.
paper voting sheets, yeah. The other thing is with this, I would just be, so now it's a little bit more of the science, right? Just be wary of what I would consider to be some ecological fallacy with this stuff, right? They're misinterpreting what you're seeing and what you think people are telling you, because we didn't, in the time that we had, we didn't necessarily say, would you like this building at this location? A lot of people were a little confused. They would say, well, where is this building? Like, I might like it at Main and Eggert, but I don't like it at, some other location. I think you just need to consider what some of the limitations are to the approach. It is valuable. It was helpful to us to kind of understand generally what people were thinking, but I think there's a temptation to over rely on what it is, and just need to be wary of that as the professional technical specialist with this.
So overall with the VPS, we thought that, the work that the committee had done with labeling that map, traditional, suburban, and the types, that was pretty much supported by what we did with the VPS. Slight changes may be required, but overall we got it pretty right. So we sort of, confirmed that with direction and sort of explained that to the town board, said we did these meetings, we see these results, we think we're going in the right direction. And as Dan was alluding to with zoning and comprehensive planning and trying to, split those two and understand the difference between those two, everybody said, well, what is the zoning? We need to know before we can, implement this plan. And so Code Studio generously said, well, we could start that work. We could start looking at the zoning and what that would be. So they came up with this sort of zoning framework, giving people an idea of how that comprehensive plan would translate to the zoning. And so they started coming up with districts, what the height of those districts would be, what uses may be there, and that sort of thing. Obviously, we've delved a lot further into that, so I'm going to leave that to Lee. But again, the big thing with this zoning was the height. And so people were very interested in how the zoning would or how the height would be reflected in the zoning. And so, started to put these different zoning districts in these different height categories. So we have our different flavors. We have that 2.5 that we kind of compromised on and said, yep, you can have your half story, and then we have 3, 4, 5, even showing a step back and how that may be part of the system. And then, showing those 8 stories, which are in specific locations, they're not going to be everywhere around town. What's interesting is that when we sort of looked at how we labeled the centers, traditional or suburban, and, if they were low scale, they would obviously have a lower height. When we looked at those and how the committee had come up with labeling those, we saw that about 50 of the centers actually had a reduction in height than what was allowed there today. So GB actually allows 65 feet in height. And so that we were considering pretty much like a 5-story building. And about 50 of those centers that we had redesignated in the plan had a reduction in height. So it was great to point out to people, we're not upzoning all of these. We're trying to fit within the context. And in many cases, that means a reduction in height that may be allowed there. So really that's what we've done with the comprehensive plan, and things have evolved since then as Lee's worked on the zoning and as our committee has met on the zoning. And so I'm going to turn it to Lee.
So I'm hoping you all want a brief break. Can I talk you into it? Because I was going to take one. And then I'll share with you the actual text from the zoning and some work that we did with the committee to get there.
So you're in one of those good places. You got a little time to yourself and now a little time to
I can see that.
I was planning on getting email on it.
Uncertain times. Oh, well then.
We're gonna go ahead and get started. Supervisor, join us in
Try to be respectful of people's time.
So we'll pick up where we left off. Kim gave us a little bit of an idea how the planning process worked and what some of the products were from that. Now Lee's going to talk about the development of the draft code and where we stand on that. Lee?
Thanks. So really, I'm just going to walk you through the mixed-use portion of the product. The actual deliverable is the full town code, town zoning code. So Chapter 203 will be replaced. The portion you're not seeing today is a reformat of many of the existing districts and the content of the code. You're welcome to, we're going to show you where to find it on the web afterwards. You're welcome to grab that and have a look at it for the other districts that we were really not impacting during this project. But this is a focus on the mixed-use districts that implement those map changes that we were just talking about. And I want to share with you at least first some of the kind of key components. So the districts themselves are clearly important. The rules for measurement are turning out to be a growing portion of our codes as they become more design-oriented. We need to describe those things for people who are not trained in design. So if you're headed towards anything past the simplest of form elements, you are going to find yourself working with people who care more about life safety than all your little gewgaws you stuck in your code. And so having the button-down rules of measurement allows those folks to be an effective part of your new planning implementation system. So that rules of measurement piece is quite important. There's a limited set of design standards here. It is possible and likely for the traditional areas that the town will actually develop companion guidelines, which are not part of the code, that will apply. Many of you may know that Williamsville already has a sort of commingled standards and guidelines manual. We've kind of stripped out things that might function as standards and included them in the code, but the guidelines document was not an obligation of this process, but is probably needed shortly after this process is completed. The use is in this piece. There isn't anything miraculous about use in here. There is a desire not to have hotels anywhere in town anymore because hotels are evil things here in Amherst now. I think we're over that. So I think even in the lowest intensity mixed use districts, we'll be able to allow hotels such that somebody could do something that was a boutique hotel or Airbnb an old building, et cetera. We are not going to talk through any of the development standards, but I have pulled together a little piece of the administration for you to show you how we've tinkered with site plan review. This is probably the riskiest part of the project to date because it hasn't had a lot of public conversation, and the ideas for it have come up here towards the end, and it's worth discussing those with you to see if any of you might be interested in some of those tools, but they may not, those ideas may not survive. I just have to point that out. So we have narrowed down the number of districts. We've split the districts now. Actually, we can look at this right-hand page. We've split the districts into infill and retrofit. And fundamentally, infill and retrofit, the split is described based on whether you are building on a lot that's probably already there, no streets involved, no new alleys, no real additional infrastructure, or whether you're building on a parcel that was something large enough that in the future we want it split into multiple pieces. And so the great majority of the town's commercially zoned property fits into the retrofit category and was actually built in patterns that nobody really wants to see in the town again, except maybe the people who like to park right in front of the store. So we have two, in the end, knowing that guidelines might be coming, we simplified the infill districts down to two, a 2.5-story version, which is the dominant version that will show up on the map, and a 4-story version for the limited set of places that either already have height today or can support height, like on the edges of the village, and potentially a few other locations where height might exist already. You saw the Key Bank site. That's a great example of where some height might be possible. So you're going to see limited application of that traditional infill 4. Those districts, their basic building massing fits on this single page, and in fact, the majority of the standards have moved over into some frontage districts that are a companion so that we can take these two base bulk and mass areas and accompany them by a set of 4 frontages, one general one which will apply if nothing is mapped, and then 3 mapped frontages. Village, which is a little shop front, which is trying to get a solid retail presence, for example, at the crossroads of Main and Main. Green, which is for areas where the setting already includes a deep green setback. and there are a number of those that lead in and out of the little village settings. And so having that green tool on the edges really creates a wonderful sense of surprise. Then when you get to the shopfront area, it feels different when you approach. It's not strung out all along because we cannot make that long a main street. We already have a very long main street in Williamsville. And when you think about Snyder, Eggertsville, Kenmore, et cetera, we just don't have enough stuff to go around in those places. So then the final frontage is residential. Doesn't require residential uses. It requires residential form. And there's some great examples of this already where there's a lawyer's office in one case, 3 stories tall with a mansard roof, that people think is a lovely little building when in fact it's a quite large building, but because it's only about 40 feet wide, and is that 2.5 story of having the pitched roof form, people are mostly satisfied with it. So actually, I'm going to blow up one of these frontages so you can have a look at it. Let's not use, let's use the village frontage. So these are a set of rules for building that frontage that would be a shop front with office or residential above. So we are using build to zones. So in this case, clearly pulling the building up towards the street between 0 and 10 feet. And then lot frontage is our term for the width of the building within that area. So the percentage of the lot that has to be covered by building. So it's presumed that most of these will be parcels of about 100 feet in width. So you'll actually be able to use the remaining space to sneak behind the building and park. Otherwise, if you want to do something larger, you're likely to have to be on a corner lot, although we do have a sort of circuit breaker provision that says nobody's ever going to be refused access if their only access is from the front and it conflicts, then they get the minimum access point that the fire department will let them have, which is probably 20-foot driveway past the side of the building, 2-way driveway, unless we could get a 1-way driveway. Parking setbacks from the street to make sure that we have active use. An important element we've always felt in designing these smaller kinds of places. Even if there were land left adjacent to the building, it would still retain this parking setback, so you would get 20 feet of green space in front of that parking lot. Right now, today, in these areas, that green is more likely to be elsewhere on the site, and it really needs to be out in that pedestrian area. Right now, the cars are there. And in fact, in the winter, the pile of snow is often encroaching on the sidewalk because it's easier to plow, right up to the edge of the parking lot. So this is potentially snow storage space and other things for adjacent parking lots as well. We did set a maximum building length. It's a quite long one if you actually measure a lot of what's here. But we really did feel like there were just a few target sites that were so large that if somebody really truly did, a structured parking, mixed-use building that was as long as the site might be, people would be offended by it. And without some breaks for pedestrians and other things to that back parking lot, the sites would be less successful. We're also interested in some story heights, pretty nominal tinkering with story height, but just trying to make sure we're getting at least a retail scale ground story. And then while you can build at 7'6" for residential in the upper stories, we didn't want to encourage anybody to do that, so we set that at 9 feet. So we are regulating in stories and feet. We also are setting a ground story elevation. You'll see the one for residential is a little taller because when you bring residential close to the street, if you want them to surveil the street and not close their shades all the time, you have to give them the advantage of some additional height to make them feel comfortable and safe. in the case of this, which is supposed to be commercial, we don't want too much trouble with the ramping and other things that would likely happen for ADA purposes, so we don't want them to get more than 2 feet above the grade of the adjacent sidewalk, which is how the story height's measured. Transparency here is quite high on that ground story, 70%, a real shop front, and then 20% in the upper stories. 20% is easy to meet. It's good residential. It actually is decent office. It's common on hotels. And it also is pretty good with the energy code. The energy code will get blown out by that ground story transparency, and that's a frustration. So you need some blank walls in some places. We're allowing those blank walls to occur on the interior side and rear of the building. We clearly have to require pedestrian access because even though the building is pulled up to the street, the parking is back behind it, and the temptation is to put the pedestrian access on the back side of the building. You're allowed to do that, but no matter what, you're going to have to build this as at least a liner building. So if you decide to put doors on the back, that's fine, but you have to have operational functional doors on the front as well. And they can't just be fire doors. They have to include transparency. So you don't want just the metal door of the emergency exit to show up on this side of the building. Entrance spacing on this frontage is 30 feet maximum, and that's measured center line to center line of the doorway in order to not let people cheat by trying to put side lights and other elements kind of pasted on the door and call that part of the door. The entrance spacing of 30 feet is fairly close to the traditional sort of 25-foot bay widths that are along many of these streets. Doesn't mean the tenant has to be that size. Right this minute, we have not included those tenant controls. We have talked about them, and they might end up in here in this traditional especially. But right now, the tenant could be any size as long as they produce these entrances. We also are getting the developer engaged in the public realm provision here by including the streetscape rules. So they will have to trick out the streetscape. If you drive along the older portions of the streetscape here in Amherst today, even on Main Street, it's in terrible shape. You know, the tree lawns have been replaced with asphalt in many places. It's rough, and it needs to be recovered sort of building by building as we go through and either re-inhabit or retrofit the existing buildings or produce new buildings. So that's just an example of kind of the elements that we would regulate. I'm just going to jump down and show you the residential frontage. I think it's pretty easy to understand. The green frontage is just a deeper setback before the Build 2 starts. It still pulls the building up to the Build 2 in the back. But this residential one is a little bit different. It is requiring a pitched roof. This is something that was really forced upon us. We believe a 3-story traditional flat-roofed shop building fits in these areas. They're there now, but no one believes they're there now, even when you show them photographs of them, unfortunately. We really had to create this element. The idea of this is really to create not yet a use transition, but a building form transition. And it's for those side streets that actually intersect the Main Street setting. So when you go down those side streets, in order to produce enough parking, in many cases, they've extended parking. What might have once been 2 or 3 houses worth has been chewed up, and we have parking lot along that edge. We're trying to encourage that edge to bring back some of that pattern to make it a little more walkable from the neighborhood to these Main Street areas, and this frontage would be used in that setting. It could also be used along the Main Street itself to taper the frontage off. So it might go the village sort of shopfront setting to the green setting to the residential setting as it moves out from one of these. Those will be discussions that will be held during the zoning map process. The general frontage would be used right now. The general frontage is the most generic and just basically slightly dumbs down the village frontage. And that would be the generic frontage. So village, green, and residential would be mapped specifically as a component of the zoning map. Whether on a single map or as a separate illustration hasn't been decided, but they will be mapped separately. So that is for the infill areas. Those infill areas, if you remember the map of Amherst, are really only that southwest quadrant for the most part. But in talking more about the retrofit of areas, especially like the mall, there was a strong feeling on all of the committees that the interior of those sites needed to be traditional. And they actually began talking about using the traditional tool in the center of those sites. And we were reluctant to allow that because the traditional tool is meant to be kind of a single lot development on an existing street, and it really doesn't tackle all the issues of a true suburban retrofit. So instead of having suburban districts, which in many of our minds was already somewhat pejorative, but is the way Amherst often feels about itself and describes itself, we went with the supervisor's terminology and brought to bear the notion of retrofit. The retrofit districts also have frontages, and the residential frontage and the village frontage are the exact same metrics, just placed again. They're actually doubled up. They don't need to be because they do use the same metrics, but they are doubled up because we package the frontages with their districts. But the retrofit districts are really, to me, the showstoppers here. They are the ones with the real potential to change our minds about what is possible in what is right now, you know, a standalone satellite city here that needs some loving rethink. So there are actually three retrofit districts. One is just two different heights. Shallow corridor, you heard from the charrette and other work that talk about that. Shallow is less than 200 feet deep for us because those are really problematic to buffer along the back. So we did a special transition along the rear of those and call them shallow corridor. There's a very limited amount of that. It's mostly on Transit Road. Deep corridor, which is those areas with the larger shopping centers now that often have gone to a block deep, say 200 to 500 feet deep from Transit Road or also Niagara Falls Boulevard. And then finally, the centers. The centers are actually sites that are typically more than 500 feet deep, whether for a single user or not today. There are sites which, because of that depth and setting, can be broken up by new streets and blocks in their redevelopment. So I'm actually going to skip across to show you what we shared with the working group when we began seriously working on these districts. And I'm going to skip ahead a little, but here you can see a little bit, you know, how small, how small the infill sites are likely to be. And then this is just a single user, which is actually smaller than many of the districts that we're likely to see in that retrofit or suburban context. So the size difference is very substantial. And of course, the look and feel is, you know, from this to this. So the look and feel is quite different as well. Here's the set of three: the shallow corridor, deep corridor, and center. And really the idea is to begin breaking up the deep corridors and setting a framework for future connections in those, and definitely breaking up all of the center sites. So just as a reminder, this is the same scale image in all three of these images. And really this is to look at the combination of the amount of land that we're dealing with and the complexity of the code that we might need to build to deal with it. So you see downtown Rochester, it has 8 districts and 5 separate overlays that treat how it's handled. In the opportunity zone, we probably will have just 2 districts and we'll have 6 frontages because of the varying road types. And in a place like Snyder, we'll probably have only 1 district available to use, and then the 4 frontages you've just seen for infill. So the scale and complexity is much simpler on those traditional places. Even though it seems like they need a lot of special care and treatment, they're actually simple from the form and character. Rebuild the form and character that was already there on your lot. That's kind of the ask. Whereas on the others, you'll be building a new form and character. So we looked at a center at Maple and Bailey. I don't know if you guys necessarily know where this is, but this is, Lasertron. This is a middle school on the other side of the site. This is Bailey extending on up, and then Beaumont Parkway, which, comes up and cuts through as a new street through this area. So, here's today. This is the traditional suburban pattern. Make sure we have enough parking lot to go with every single standalone building. Right, that's kind of the model you're looking at. So that's really just 2 blocks. There are no meaningful internal streets on either side of Beaumont Parkway, and actually, if you included the middle school, the block would continue to extend to the east a fair ways before you would hit a real street. What we aspire to is something with active edges and people-oriented places and walkable streets that can come into those places. And so there is some sense of some kind of maximum project build-out. We're not going to achieve this until we can afford to build either structured parking or until parking demands change so radically that we don't have to build parking. We are not blessed, as downtown Buffalo may be, with the ability to say no parking for these areas. We could, we would just still continue to get an awful lot of parking. So there is really an idea in these districts that the retrofit districts have to achieve at the bare minimum this project. A set of core streets, perhaps surrounded by surface parking lots for now, that are lined for their walkability, that provide shop fronts as a portion, that provide some open space on the site, and that allow us to traverse the site east and west and also north and south. So how do we do that? So here's how the code does it. This would likely be designated Center 5. It's not near enough to the freeway to get that Center 8 designation. It's not a large enough parcel to really internally accommodate 8 stories. 8 stories demand structured parking. 5 stories can potentially be cheated into place with surface parking as long as some of the buildings weren't 5 stories. So we'll look at the district pages in a minute, but one of the district pages begins by setting a standard for blocks that is going to break that set of 2 blocks up. In this particular case, we were trying very hard to leave intact the uses on their existing blocks so that we could have a phased retrofit of the site, so that much of the existing economic activity could stay in place while we were working towards the next phase and the new buildings. And so these blocks have things sitting on them, and that's the reason they are the shape they are. Also, the smaller blocks exist because we've added a rule that says if you pierce your block and allow the pedestrians to move through it, we'll allow you a slightly larger block size. So there are, in a sense, 2 approaches to the block. So that's what you're seeing here is a set of blocks that are accommodating what was on the ground underneath actually probably here you can see them the best, right? So some of these buildings are still functional in the new block pattern. And that's helpful to the development community in order to be able to pay for all this new infrastructure. Now, could somebody come in and take this down in one fell swoop? Potentially, they're going to be a bigger player than we were kind of expecting, but it could happen. And especially with the opportunity zone, you know, things may change in that regard. So, but the rules basically force you to do the core streets. The core street is a specific frontage, and actually the street has its own cross-section. And the cross-section for the street is right now just one lane in each direction on these internal streets. These replace what were drive aisles, et cetera, through these parcels, and give us access north, south, east, west through the parcel. There is a requirement to produce some open space on sites over a certain size. And that requirement for open space, we hope, will also generate something desirable enough that we will then apply the core streets around that parcel as well, because we want to activate that space. So really a core street is just a walkable street of some sort, either a shopfront street or a residential street. And it can taper off, you know, one to the other, but it's one of those two flavors. The other streets are designated really based on their function today. So you'll see the minor arterial on the south, that's Maple. That's its designation in the comp plan transportation materials. Collector Street for Bailey across the outside. And therefore, all the rest of the streets proposed here would be local streets. They're less than collector scale streets. So that sets the framework for then applying all of these frontages. The minor arterial frontage has a certain characteristic. A minor arterial is not going to be tamed into, you know, a tiny little street anytime soon. And therefore, we're not going to put our cafes out here. We're not going to put a lot of those kinds of things. Some of those will have to exist internally. We might build to the corner at the entrance, as the minor arterial image is showing here. On the collector street, though, collector streets could potentially function as a core street and could be given the core street functionality. So they're kind of a half-breed in between really a street that is focused on carrying, you know, traffic and volume, and a street that has high walkability and high-quality spaces. Depending on what the person owned, if they owned this piece here to the side, then it might be actually more desirable to run the core street here and encompass it within your property. You're rarely, probably as a developer, going to put a core street on the edge of your property and give all of your value to the next guy over, right? You're going to want to internalize it. So that's what we've drawn here. But you could designate the core street on the edge of the property. Then there's the local streets, just sort of what falls out of the system after the core streets and the others are done. Here's the core street frontages. There is a requirement that 20% of the streets get designated, and there's a further requirement that a portion be designated for that sort of retail shopfront, which is the darker red. So you really are showing here residential or office streets leading up to a core that is where your focused retail is near the green space. So those frontages exist, and they have all their metrics the same as the kinds we were looking at. What you really have generated here is a regulating plan for the site. This is just like what form-based codes generate, normally imposed, in this case, in a sense, given a set of rules, given an algorithm that says, here's how you generate a decent place, and that algorithm is generating the regulating plan on the site. Now, the developer still has a lot of control over what kinds of streets and the placement of all these kinds of things. But they're also going to be stuck with things to consider, like where are my curb cuts today and where are my utilities and lots of other things that might force them to design something very similar to this. And of course, once this core street is established, as a community and as a planning board, as they review the site plans, they're going to be asking to extend that and connect it to this street back here. know, that's the kind of thing that will be a possible discussion in the future that will be very important in extending the designs beyond a single site. So really, that's what generates you the project. Now, there's two more elements that I can't show you realistically, so I've shown you hypothetically. It is actually not zoned residentially back here. But if it were, the two tools for that are, again, the deep transition here. It's shown layered over a set of storm ponds that are there already, which would function as part of that transition. That's the first idea, is to use, landscaping and area to help handle that. And then the second idea here is, if it were residential across the way, we would apply that residential frontage along that back roadway. So there would be actually a form and architectural transition as well. So that's what would give you the back edge of a big amorphous, red or pink blob on the map. Doesn't apply if that zoning isn't in place. It's a zoning district boundary kind of idea. So that's what we had shared with the committee, and here are the actual district pieces. Just a couple things I want to show you from these. First is on the shallow, we're actually just asking for a backage road. Today, most of these sites are connected towards the front because the parking lots are out in the front, the buildings are in the back. We are asking to bring the buildings up to the extent possible, and so you see there is a requirement here for cross-access and a shared access drive. And because of some other requirements that go with those about the spacing for the distances, you'll have those periodically and moved away from the corners. And so actually, these districts, while they are improving the walkability and usability of the site, are actually, hopefully over time, improving the functionality of the major roadway system as well, because we're doing access management that was not in place before. So shallow corridor. The deep corridor is actually deep enough that what happens on its site is you get a half of a street in front of the building. So we're not asking for the full street to be built out adjacent to a parking lot. We're anticipating the building, in this case, is still to the rear, and we're building a half street in front of it, and we're presuming that one day in the future, we'll actually be able to build out that parking lot with another building. There's nothing that precludes you from having a building on it now, or putting a building out there, but the demand for parking is likely to be balanced here such that the front half is parking, there'll be a fully designed half street, and then the building face. So the feeling of walking along that half street will be a little bit more like walking through a shop front in another more mixed-use setting. Finally, the centers, all of those rules come together. We have a 5-story version. If you watch the image on the right where the buildings are, the only difference between the 5 and the 8-story version is how tall the little mass and bulk for the buildings pops up, because otherwise the rules are functionally the same between the 5-story district and the 8-story district. The frontages include that local street, collector street, minor arterial, major arterial, a half street for cross access where, for example, along the corridors, we're going to need to enter a property, and we're asking you to improve that access to the point where it can be used as a shared access in the future, and therefore we're asking for a different kind of street there. I can cheat and show you the streets in a minute. They're only in the current draft, but those streets at the half street are really the only way to be fair to the developer in coming in adjacent where there is going to be a shared obligation. So a little more obligation falls on the first guy, admittedly. And that's because they have to build the drive aisles for the adjacent development, because you can't just have those half streets serve as one way in. So here are the designation of the streets. This is still a moving target, but you will also have to choose how you're removing bicycles through the site. And so in this case, we've drawn it here with the bicycle on the core street, but the bicycle could also be on the local street instead, as chosen by the developer. So there is a min and max configuration for both with the bike lane and without the bike lane. So it's shown here with the bike lane, and the dimensions will be here. Splitting up the difference between the sidewalk and sort of the furniture and planting zone. This is a behind the curb bike lane, sort of most sensible and successful separation of bikes right in the midst of a mixed-use area. Then the curb, parking lane, 2 travel lanes, parking lane, and the same. This could be expanded to include a center turn lane if the traffic configuration was substantial enough. So there is a center turn lane shown in each of these. That would probably happen only in the case of having a significant user that was time-based. So for example, if you have users like movie theaters and other things where you've got a whole lot of queuing up all at one point in time, both leaving and coming, that's the kind of time you might want to go to the third lane and give yourself that turn lane. So that's the street configuration for the core street. You can see here we've chopped it in half. If your core street was along the edge of your property adjacent to another development that will be mixed use, then you get to build half of it, but half of it turns out to be a little more than half of the total right. So you actually have to scooch this thing onto your property because you're actually building that additional lane, right, to get the in and out travel. So you're going to build a little more than necessary, but you'll still have a very good one-sided street. This is also the one that would be used in that deep corridor. So imagine that's now my big box retail or whatever it turned out to be. It actually would have a good street along that side. Along the front of the building. In addition to the core street, then the local street, as shown, we have not shown it with the bike lane, but it could be the bike facility as well on the local street. So here you're seeing it in its full form. In order to, again, make it more cost effective for the developer, but reasonable to get a good street eventually, the local half street has no parking on it. So actually here all you're having to do is build your 2 drive lanes adjacent to each other right at the edge of the property, and then the streetscape for one side of the street. And finally, the alley and drive lane. So in certain cases, we may have residential or other settings. You might have townhouse or other places that you are rear accessing. You might have garages back there. This is really a totally a service lane that would sit back there. They don't apply to this particular one. But the final real street type is that alley and drive lane. So we're presuming that we are not asking the developer to do anything but his own internal streets. Those exterior streets, if those are somebody else's streets, and they have to worry about what's going on in their right of way, etc. So these are the developer's internal streets. In our minds, they can be private or public, as long as they're built to public standard. It doesn't matter if they turned out to be private streets, and especially if they want to, trick them out and paver them and, whatever, it might be better if they actually maintained them than if the town did. So those will be conversations, I'm sure, with each of the major developers. There's only one more thing that I'd like to show you. And I'm sorry I'm running long, but we are proposing to modify the site plan review process. And this has 2 important elements. Right now in Amherst, minor site plan is under 4,000 square feet, which is like nothing, right? Nobody who builds under 4,000, I guess houses, but under that, not even houses anymore, maybe. So we propose to raise that. Right now, we've thrown in 25,000 square feet. We're not sure that can survive. So that's one idea, is increase the amount of these that are looked at the staff level. Even when they're looked at the staff level, however, because some will have significant area for discussion, the minor site plan can be converted to a major site plan. It can be bumped up. And the reason that that's important is, let's say we get in place the 25,000 square foot limit. If that is on one of the precious sites in Snyder or Eggertsville, it is quite likely that we'll need to hold the public hearing that's associated with the major site plan and have that conversation transparently and in the public. And everybody will sense that from the minute the application comes in, right? Staff always knows whether this one is going to stir it up or not. So we've provided that bump up provision. The final piece that we have produced here is a design exception process. So right now in the town, if you need to vary from these prescriptive standards that we are setting, you would go to the planning board, you would be sent back to ZBA to look at your variance, they would perhaps grant it, and then you would come back to the planning board to finish your site plan. So it is an onerous process, and it is not very holistic. So the notion of the design exception and the express language of it is based on something that happens in architecture all the time, which is called equivalent or better. So especially in historic districts, we use that phrase all the time. So when you're supposed to use slate on your roof, you can propose to use an alternative to slate as long as it's equivalent or better. Right? It lets you choose something that can be similar. It actually might perform better in many ways, maybe in terms of the environment or maybe in terms of energy or whatever else. In the case of many of these frontages and their requirements for streets, there are going to be instances where the developer needs to ask for relief. Let's just take the simplest one. I have a grocery store, and they have their big coolers, and because of the way the site's oriented and where the power comes into the building and whatever, they're going to block some of the windows. So they don't want to put the windows on that portion of the building. So I'm going to end up with some blank wall, and it's going to exceed my blank wall standard here, and they actually want to reduce the total amount of transparency on that wall facing the street, because what they're putting inside is going to blank it out anyway. So you want them to propose to you something that's equivalent or better at activating the street. And those are the kinds of design exceptions that could be considered. So it's just a way, instead of a variance in which we basically say you don't have to meet the standard. Oh, poor owner, you don't have to meet that standard. We'll just give you this relief. We're giving you the relief but asking you to design something that functions in the same way so that we have an alternative. And we're not speccing that alternative. We don't know what all those possibilities are. Certainly staff could begin to have conversations about that. But really we're asking the applicant to think creatively about meeting the intent of these walkable mixed-use areas in a different way. So those are our procedural elements that we're tinkering with. Those may not survive the adoption process here. They'll be a relatively tough conversation to have, I'm sure. So that's really the extent of the actual regulations. It's very few pages in the scheme of things that regulate all of these ideas that we've been working several years on. It's all boiled down into those bits and pieces. Oh, we also did want to show you, Kim, you want to kind of talk them through this? I'll go wherever you want me to go.
Yeah, sure. So to get to this page, if you go to our home page, you can keyword in Imagine Amherst, 2 words, and it will bring you to the project page. So this page just gives you the project overview, a little bit about what we've done, and a little bit of the schedule. If you look up, on the right-hand side there's different pages you can go to. So, you have your comprehensive plan amendment, so kind of described what we did with that. And I think the final sort of comprehensive plan amendment is there. But really, I think what is most important to point out is the work products page. These are all the work products that have been produced thus far and endorsed by the committees. So if you go towards the bottom, some of them are minor memos that were required for the NYSERDA grant. But if you go towards the bottom, there's the comprehensive plan amendment again, and then actually what Lee had just described to you, and in the larger format with the whole code reformatted, and with those mixed-use districts included, is the very last item thus far. And so these are really the places where you can take a look at those documents, gather what you'd like out of them. Maybe that could apply to your own communities. And as Dan described, there's also a page on here with meeting minutes, notes, videos from all of our committee meetings that you can check out as well.
Questions?
So with that, I've been talking at you for a long time. Anybody have any questions or comments? Or
I've got a couple of questions. I'm curious, one, about your planning committee and your technical committee, and if there were any examples of conflict between those committees, or if the technical committee really took what the planning committee did and broke it down, or if there were some things that you had to get past
start with that?
Yeah.
that relationship.
So for the most part, the planning committee, most of the people on the technical committee were on the planning committee to begin with. So there was kind of a carryover. It was a little bit more subtractive in nature. We wanted to make sure that we were able to move through the content of the planning committee's work. The big change, I think, overall was when we shifted to the technical committee. Our goal was to sort of parse it in a way that was about usability of the code. So a lot more of our staff were actively participating at the table, and we tried to keep it to the boards that would have to deal with some discretion over the thing. As far as conflict, I mean, really the only change came from I don't know if it was a conflicting point. It was more of an elaboration that Lee talked about, going from this kind of typical sort of context of suburban to an overwhelming desire by a technical committee to see a more traditional facing applied to the buildings. So that piece would be the one thing that I think that the two committees weren't necessarily connected on it. Although I can't say that the planning committee took it so far, it wasn't like they were far away. If you look at some of those drawings that Kim showed from the charrette and from the plan, those outcomes, they were a fairly traditional treatment. It's just that that committee was stopped shy of branding it traditional, and the picking it up, I think a little bit at the impetus of the town board, and then the current state of the committee, basically this technical group, then kind of ran with that idea that this is a traditional treatment mapped out over large geographic areas.
I think largely the technical group that started in the planning process is there to review draft material, not necessarily to judge it, but just to identify any potential issues that we might want to consider and put forward to the planning group. So we really vested a lot of responsibility in the planning group initially, and then as Brian's describing, as it got into the more technical aspects of zoning code, kind of took on the form that Brian's describing. But really, I think it was the technical committee's role initially to just kind of screen this stuff, look for the issues, identify those to the planning committee, not eliminate anything, but just make people aware where there might be some issues to consider.
Jim? So that's interesting. The biggest conversations inside the technical committee came in the traditional parking environment, and basically what we kind of said was we're going to apply ULI best practice, but we're going to significantly reduce the town's minimum parking standards, which have been for a long time sort of the town's found workarounds, right? So we had huge minimum standards, so then we created a shared parking alternative program. It was like all you did was give somebody a way out of your minimum parking standards. So why not just fix the problem and reduce the minimum parking standards? So, some of the shared parking stuff will stay in language alternative parking analysis, but we're going to, at the core, reduce the minimums, and that bodes well, we've had, and that, frankly, those comments were coming from developers that you wouldn't even think would be telling you that we're worried about the town minimums, so like the Bendersons of the world are saying, hey, if you would reduce your minimum standards, we could develop more densely. And it's like, what? Okay, let's talk about that. But I think that there's a general acceptance that, that planning for Black Friday every day is inappropriate, and we've just got too much asphalt out there.
I guess one of the other things to think about, and I'm sure, Jim, you'll be faced with this. We're still going to be faced with this, is changing technology, right? So how to deal with AVs and maybe the prospect of a light rail corridor coming down by the mall area. How does that affect the parking demand? And I don't know that we've thought that through fully, but something that you'll face and challenge you.
I do think that we snuck the alternative parking study in the last time because nobody wanted us to touch any of the numbers at all. And I do think it has been a functional tool for the intervening period. It did let us get to the point where people realized you don't need quite so much.
It's almost more a function of just a higher level of flexibility, especially in hard to deal with places, and it gets utilized frequently.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit of a purist. At the end of the day, if I had my way, I would just say drop all parking minimums and let the market deal with it. Because the market's going to sort out the parking, right? It's going to tell you, if you want to build this building, I want to sign this lease, I need X amount of parking available. So, we're still in this flux where we're going to reduce minimums. We're going to have some shared parking alternative and strategies, but we're still not quite letting the market force take over. And I think ultimately moving into the question of how technology is going to work, I think that's that's going to end up really changing the game. If you're in New York City right now, it's as easy to get a cab as it is to get an Uber, and you pay for it off your phone, and nobody has to worry about parking anymore. At the same time, as long as you have parking availability, people are going to say, I'll just take my own car and I'm not going to take an alternative. So we're sort of subsidizing the problem a little bit by allowing, by creating parking minimums and creating these big parking rooms. We're just further exposing ourselves to the issue. So, but that's what it is. Sure, yeah. It doesn't. No, absolutely not.
There's always people who are on both sides of the issue too much and too little. The project proposed for downtown that's eliminating the surface parking lot, and that's the biggest conversation, is, oh my God, you're eliminating surface parking downtown.
Yeah.
You're never making anyone happy. The nice thing about parking minimums, and we don't have them, is at least there's a baseline for the conversation. You can say, well, they met the minimum. What do you want us to do? I'm not advocating about the
Yeah, admittedly, that's why this community decided, well, we're still going to keep a minimum. So at the end of the day, the planning board can say, we're not here to talk about numbers. They met their numbers, or you didn't meet your numbers. If you met your numbers, great. If not, go to zoning board. But we're just still in a trap, right?
There's no easy conversation. You're talking about permanent, you're losing already.
Yes, and Western New York doesn't think that there's autonomous vehicles or Uber or anything. Those things don't exist. They exist in New York and other cities. They're not here.
Just curious, if a Core Street in a retrofit district can be used as an example for a more unified pedestrian street, pedestrian sidewalk improvement. Could it connect to another Core Street?
Of course. Of course. So all of the new street types that developers would be required to add have a walkable component. Some will have a separated bikeable component, but some operate slowly enough that the bike in the lane will be possible. So really every street is going to be multimodal as imagined. The street that has not been drawn, and we talked about briefly yesterday with the folks who came to visit the supervisor to talk about the NFTA, next NFTA grant round, is really the one that accommodates the streetcar. And there's a lot of conflicting conversation about how that is best done. So I think this is going to go forward without that idea, but eventually we'll need that street type. But all the other street types are, they're walkable in the crudest sense, meaning they'll have a connected, high-quality sidewalk. And yes, we are anticipating, and future planning can supplement the individual planning by applicants. So you would think that perhaps 10 years out, when we're doing comprehensive planning, we're going to look at all these things we didn't quite connect up that all have these stubs on them and say, there's only one way for this road to go anymore. This is going to be a core street, that's going to be a core street, et cetera. So I can see this incrementally gaining momentum to where you are connecting really an entire area and building the equivalent of a new sort of periodic Main Street. Some retail, some residential office, some more retail, some residential office, et cetera. Good to know. One of the other things the committee was asking for when we were talking about this is really more, even though this is new and they wouldn't be retrofits, more alley retrofits, the sort of notion of enabling those narrower, smaller passageways for pedestrian purposes. So that is something that I think as this project continues to move forward, people will be pushing to investigate that end of the spectrum, the even smaller street that just moves people.
Can somebody get me to the shot of Boulevard Mall for a minute? Either an aerial or a PowerPoint or something. So
I can put it
either way.
We're live on the internet.
Okay. Just a Google Earth. So one of the issues talking about pedestrian corridors that we acknowledged is with the planned light rail extension and the locations of the planned locations or the initial planned locations for light rail stations, there really isn't a way to get right from these neighborhoods. I guess this isn't.
Seems like it's dead, doesn't it?
So there isn't a way to get from the neighborhoods that you see to the east, right? The sort of bulk single-family detached or the multifamily out to, you can't walk necessarily, even though it's a half mile to quarter mile. You can't walk to where the light rail stations are because you literally have a mall in your way. as the mall starts to diminish and parts of the mall come offline and they open up, the goals would be to extend, the pedestrian realm from North Bailey straight across to traverse the site to give you that quarter mile to half mile walk to light rail and light rail destinations. And that's a big component for us. That was a big component. Ultimately, those core streets, the conversation is, we want them built to town standards. The eventuality is we'll probably talk about some town turnover or takeover because we're going to want that connectivity, out of the hands of the private sector and make those public roads. So that's all kind of a piece of the puzzle.
It seems that height was the most controversial thing you dealt with, and I'm sure the conversation kept going back to those stories. Was there any consideration given to proximity to height? What residents feel comfortable in terms of, well, what
Yeah.
they feel comfortable with in that situation?
So
And there was some flexibility that appeared in a lot of your centers that not infill. Are those generally your parks are so shallow?
So what happens in the town of Amherst, right, is that, it's like anywhere else, right? There's a big vocal minority that comes out at some point during a project. And so the town had faced kind of Dan mentioned it early on, two controversial projects in terms of height. One developer bought an entire block of residential stock to buffer themselves, and so they didn't see that much challenge. There was some. And the other developer nested a property right in back of a high building, right in back of a very affluent neighborhood. And so controversy began. At the end of the day, the basic baseline is, hey, look, if you're developing in Snyder or Williamsville, and you have a dense product or big product pulled up next to residential, we're going to worry about that. But, the kind of take a free pass on whatever you want to do over on the west side of town. That's kind of what the residents have said. So if we're building along the boulevard in that opportunity zone, there's areas where there may be a couple stragglers, single family, parcels, but they're kind of by happenstance, and everybody acknowledged that those probably shouldn't have been built there. They just were built at some point. But they're nested now within some of the higher density, sort of bigger envelopes. So, yeah, I think there's a general acceptance of if it's in this opportunity zone and it wants to go vertical, it's going to go vertical. If somebody wants to build a hotel, they're going to go, 6, 7, 8 stories. That's just the nature of the beast. The one thing I want to, I guess, add to the mix is if you zoom out, Lee, and just look at University's North Campus, right? So this is one of those things you try to communicate this, and the university's North Campus does such a great job of placing itself on an island surrounded by moats of transportation and inhospitable walking areas that there's like a competition to try to grab any site that is closest to the center of the university. So what you see is this big development pattern along Sweet Home Road right now, right? So if you look at that between the 990 and Sweet Home, that's some of our latest higher densities. Big mixed-use products, big hotels, and, the question becomes, like, is this really where we want that product? And it's just a struggle to get as close to the university's entrances as you can. And there really isn't a hospitable way of doing that. So the prospect of light rail coming in, right, coming right through the university means that somebody locating, say, on Sweet Home and Maple, or on Maple, anywhere on Maple could say we're 2 stops away from the center of campus. That changes the game a lot because it's no longer, you'd be on Sweet Home and we'll shuttle you into campus or you can be on Sweet Home and you're a half-mile walk to the center, to the campus, or you're a short car ride and then figure out parking. Now you're two stops away. You know, you get on the rail and you literally go 2 stops and you're in the middle of the campus. So it's going to really, or it has already started to shift the mindset of people who are looking to build higher density student housing and who are looking to build, hotels and stuff like that to service the campus. There was a time where, this university had thoughts of growing east, and, that seems to be stopping. So now the thought is basically, hey, we're going to end up kind of shoving this density into the private sector realm and shove it to the west. We have this anomaly of Audubon Parkway, which is an old, tired office environment, and student housing now trying to locate on Audubon with the hope and prospect of a terminus for light rail coming in Muir Woods north of the 990, so that, once again, you may be 2 miles removed from the campus, but you can say you're 2 stops. It's a fascinating change, and it's really interesting to see the national investment that comes with student housings just jumping at light rail is a prospect. And so, good, and, at the same time, a little scary, because without the zoning being correct, you're just kind of at the whim of, I don't know that we would have tried to put those heavy mixed-use products on Sweet Home with the grade change and the break, and, so now is our time to kind of correct and steer all that.
Like part of the challenge with the university too is and this doesn't relate specifically to the zoning, but the ped access to the campus is really poor.
Sucks.
And because the university is, I think, concerned about liabilities and some other aspects, they're not even really interested in allowing adjacent ped access to the university campus itself in some places. So, for example, we have a project right here, which is about, like, you would think if we're looking for density in student housing, we have a project right here with a fair number of beds, if you will, adjacent to the campus, but can't achieve anything but a fence without a gate along this university road. Now, admittedly, it would be difficult to walk from here over here, but you could walk from here over here or some other place. So that just gaining, you've got folks that are living down in this part of the town, that walk across the town recreational campus to get to campus, crossing streets. It's a real challenge. And so, as we talk more and more about ped access and the attractiveness of that, we've got some real challenges with what is probably the largest pedestrian generator in the community.
If ever there were a reason to allow scooters, there it is, right there.
So, yeah, you know what? So what's interesting, if you look at where that Buffalo Marriott is, that they're an active ped counter on Flint, right? Now, mind you, you're a good 1.5 miles from Capon, from that point. That ped counter was generating was a staggering 100 peds an hour, walking up Flint and crossing Maple.
Generated in here.
Yeah.
In here.
So, and as you get a lot of the foreign students, that's nothing for a walk for them. They're going to walk it. It's just that our treatment there is terrible. So, part of this same zoning retrofits that area, that corridor, as well. So,
Yeah, there are simply much better patterns to put these intensities or even higher intensities on the ground. This happens to be one of the few potential 8-story sites, is that triangle, because the Marriott is 10 stories today.
So one of the questions we wrestled with was what kind of densities can we accommodate? You know, UB is showing this campus growing at a demand for student housing at about 4% a year. So it's a fairly, you know, large number of beds that can come online annually. And the market's trying to fill that, right? And you can see it. You know, we see it with the people who come in. They're going to get in line now before whatever happens over on, you know, on the Boulevard Mall site. So there was a scramble this year. Core Campus opened one, sued the town to try to get the project moving. It was stalled. This board kind of rectified that problem, but they developed, Landmark came in and developed a higher density product right away, and now there's a product developing in Muir Woods, and the kicker was they still have a backlog of beds they need to supply, the private sector needs to supply just to catch up with the current demand. So they're struggling to do that, but they all want to be in before some developer buys the mall or Benderson decides they're going to go residential over at Ridge Lee. And so the arms race for student housing is crazy, and you know it's great, but it's crazy. So.
Other questions? I appreciate everybody's time, and one of the objectives of this project was to provide an experience and tools and maybe some insights to other communities, all due respect to Nadine and the city, to some of the other suburban communities who face the same kind of challenges that we do in certain places. Not that you don't, but certainly Transit Road, Niagara Falls Boulevard are shared boundaries between us, and so maybe there's some tools here that we can use to kind of retrofit those places. I know, Jim, you're getting ready to do some zoning. Jim and John, I know you guys are always working with your zoning, so hopefully there's some things here. Nadine, maybe there's something here that'll be helpful to the city as well. I know we're grateful. Tony had to leave, but we're grateful to NYSERDA for the opportunity to do this, and still got a little bit of work to do here, but appreciate that opportunity. Anybody else?
Send them home.
All right. Thanks so much for coming.
Well, I got a question.
Tom?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Tony and Bob with NFGA, they both left. Wanted to, as far as the purpose of the project having to do with the Governor Cuomo's Cleaner, Greener Communities, a major statewide initiative that encourages communities to incorporate sustainable goals and principles in local decision making. That you mentioned the building height, but there wasn't anything that was said about the as far as the watersheds, like the latitude, longitude, and elevation of the properties. That these should be standard operating procedures. The other one has to do with the impervious surface ratio analysis of the town, and that this is going to be an evolving project. And one of the design features that I think it should have should be to facilitate the public transit station. As far as to reduce the auto traffic, and that these are multifaceted aspects having to do with the GBNRTC as far as what they're doing with the Worley Drive and Young's Road as far as the access to the throughway, and doing something positive long term. Really, they said that as far as a transportation infrastructure project that looks at like a 30-year. Thank you, I appreciate it. As far as the one region forward, as far as being tied into this thing.
All right, thank you, Tom.
Bells and whistles and horns on it so you can access the information.
All right, thanks, Tom.
You're welcome. Probably the village met last night. And, you know, as far as the tying it into the education, as far as the watershed.
I know, I talked to my wife.
Right, we're going to restore Elk Creek. So don't have to repair the pool.
Okay, great.
I'll be on PA and Lancaster.
That's great. I got a lot of information put together. Robert from the MFTA. January? Five. Is Dan Alonsky around? Is he with you guys? Oh, okay. How